Hello, everyone in the cohort. This is Francesco Gambino, and
Hi, everyone. This is Gabe Brown.
we worked on this project together because we had a unique opportunity that we both work at Cherry Hill High School West, where we teach high school students. I teach high school art in grades 9 through 12. Gay?
And I teach 9th and 10th graders. I'm the Title I English teacher at Cherry Hill High School West as well.
Cool. So let's just get right into it. We will have this presentation. We chose to go with Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks is a feminist social justice leader. She's an author. She's an educator. She has greatly influenced the pedagogy of teachers to use education to help oppressed individuals rise above their social classifications. Gay, is there anything you want to add to that?
Nope, that's fantastic.
Cool. Bell Hooks said, to teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential.
Okay.
So, you want to talk about the philosophy, please?
Yeah. Also, I wanted to just add the fact that this learner development project has given us an opportunity to collaborate, and that's really important, especially in our field, whether it's education or learning, not just between students, but also between colleagues. And so we both read Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom by Bell Hooks. And from her principles and her teachings, we found three things that are really important in terms of our teaching approach. So first being education as freedom. The next thing, teaching in multicultural classrooms. And our last item is engaging critical thinkers.
Cool. For Black folks, teaching, educating was fundamentally political because it was rooted in anti-racist struggle. Indeed, my all-Black grade schools became the location where I experienced learning as a revolution. So Bell Hooks, there's no secret that Black and brown children, as well as females as well, they have to deal with racism, sexism, classism, and all other forms of oppression in the world as part of their daily routine, which Bell Hooks talks about how education is the avenue to rise above all of that stuff. Historically speaking, Gay and I talked earlier about how it was legitimately illegal to teach oppressed people how to read and write, because that is the way that people can then learn to better their situation and rise out of a situation. So Bell Hooks talks about how education is freedom. To learn to open up knowledge is to free the mind and to learn how to rise above your situation. And that's one of the main points that she's all about. Gay, do you want to add to that?
Yes. Also, I thought about how recently there's been this huge movement, which is not new, about censorship in school libraries. And it just points to that idea of knowledge being power. But also it brings us a question: who has the power to distribute that knowledge, and what knowledge are we willing to share with our children, and what knowledge are we taking away from them?
Absolutely. So for the next point, teaching in multicultural classrooms.
Yes. So the quote that we pulled from the book is, if the effort to respect and honor the social reality and experiences of groups in the society who are non-white is to be reflected in a pedagogical process, then as teachers on all levels, from elementary to university settings, we must acknowledge that our styles of teaching may need to change. So a part of teaching in multicultural classrooms is the will and motivation to change, which I believe Frank and I both have, and to learn. And throughout the school year at my own school, I've noticed that there's a conversation of, there's an increase in apathy among students. Black and brown students aren't necessarily doing as well in comparison to white students. However, I think that a lot of that conversation comes from staff not being necessarily trained or educated or even interested in how to teach marginalized groups. But I think that teachers, they need to integrate opportunities for students to develop their identities. And as a 9th grade and 10th grade teacher, that's really important, because at ages 14 to 16 years old, you're really trying to find out who you are. And also you need to find out who you are in relation to our community or society as a whole. So that's why I have this wheel of power here, which I want to have my kids interact with, so they can figure out where do they align in terms of like how close they are to power and how far away they are in power in certain areas, so they can figure out, well, which ways is my life affected or not affected, or like how can I use my privilege to bring power to other people.
Yeah, and just from the notion of being on the teaching side of it as well, it's, it comes down to that age-old notion of like, if you don't understand your students, you're not going to be able to reach your students. You're not going to build relationships with your students, and understanding the different struggles that they may encounter, or just find out where they're coming from, is going to make the difference of establishing that relationship to be able to find success in your classroom.
Absolutely.
All
All
right.
right, and our last point, engaging critical thinkers. The quote that I pulled was, "When education is the practice of freedom, students are not the only ones who are asked to share, to confess." Engaging in pedagogy does not seek simply to empower students. So the benefit of this entire process, even though it is a lot of work and it's intentional, it just doesn't empower students, it empowers teachers as well, not just to be better teachers, but to be better members of our society and be more aware. Also, it requires us to display vulnerability if we're gonna conduct critical thinking and critical conversations. Then we have to model those behaviors, and a part of that is showing vulnerability and openness, so that our students can do the same.
Yeah, I think that's why the workshop type classroom is really important, because when we as teachers engage in the work alongside of our students, to show them that like we're not perfect on our own. Like I'm gonna
Right.
make different types of artistic mistakes, and I'm sure every once in a while you're gonna make some grammar mistakes too. And like the students are gonna pick up on that and see that we're human, we're all part of the learning process. And that helps just kind of ground us and make us vulnerable.
Right. And also, I think it shows students that, like, one, we're not perfect, but two, like, what do you do when things don't go according to plan? Like, are you able to pivot? Are you flexible? Which is
Yeah.
really important.
Should I share that story that I said earlier about the
Absolutely.
driving test?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so ironically, this just happened yesterday, last period of the day. I had a student in one of my art classes who's sitting on his desk, head down, and I go over to him and I ask him, like, "Hey man, what's going on? Tell me about your day." And he said he was really upset because he failed his driver's test and he has to wait 2 weeks to take it again. So it was a really great opportunity to share with him the story of when I failed my driver's test and I had to wait 2 weeks, and how I went home crying because my dad told me I had to take the test with a car that was missing a side mirror, and they failed me on the spot. And I was very upset, but I shared this story with the student. Next thing you know, we're both laughing, and he's working on his painting project. It was a great little moment.
Yeah. And I think that's great because it shows empathy. Also, sometimes as adults, that we get so caught up in what we have to do in our lives that we sometimes forget what it's like to be a young person. And like, for a young person not passing your driver's license, like, that's like how you gonna tell people? Like, people are
We're
like,
gonna
oh,
bounce
you
back
didn't.
from that as a student. Like, it matters so much in that moment, and it's easy to forget that stuff. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So in practice, we're going to show how we have been practicing what we have learned from reading with about bell hooks.
Yep. Okay. So one of the pre-reading activities I had my students do was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood themed, called "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" So students, we were basically just having a conversation. We started off with group discussion, and then we led out into a whole class discussion. Here are just a couple of the questions that we talked about. Do our communities define who will become? Explain your opinion. How can being a good neighbor change the world for the better? Give an example. And how can you be a helper in our community, Cherry Hill West, Cherry Hill, Camden County, and provide an example. So basically what that does is help pull in their prior knowledge to help them build stronger connections to what we're going to read. And that also shows up in the written responses that they provide. Once we ask them critical questions about the text, once we do our close reads, they're able to, in their explanations, really elaborate on the themes in the book. Thank you. Also, how does this apply to Bell Hooks and her principles and her theories? Well, she talks about making the classroom a democratic setting in order to create transformative classrooms. But you also have to talk about the issue of voice. You have to pay attention to who is speaking and who is listening in these conversations. So in order to make it a more democratic setting, what I did was I implemented a toss and talk. So here are just a list of the examples, not the examples, the instructions to facilitate a toss and talk. And so a question is shared out to the whole entire class. The group that was responsible for that question, they're handed the ball first, and whoever has the ball is the one who is speaking, so that they were able to listen and hear each other effectively. And then after they answer their question, they toss it to someone that's outside of their group. And once the person gets the ball, they can either say they agree or disagree and then explain why. Because we just can't make claims. We have to defend and give reasons for how we think. And also they could share a personal story or a real life scenario that relates to the discussion that we're having or the question that was asked. Also, if they get the ball and they're confused and they don't know what to do, they can toss it back. But in order to toss it back to the person, they have to ask a clarifying question. Because more than likely, if they got the ball and they don't know what to do next, more than likely they're not the only person in the class that doesn't know what to do. So asking a clarifying question, it doesn't just help pull them into the conversation, it helps also pull anyone else who is lost into the conversation.
That's a great way to keep everyone together and engaged. I love that.
That, and also I forgot to mention, I apologize. So once again, the issue of voice, you have to pay attention to who is speaking and who is listening. So those who are speaking or feel more confident to speak regularly, usually are people who are closest to power, rather than those that are traditionally listening are further away from power, or they're in marginalized groups. Mm-hmm. So you have to pay attention to really who is speaking and who is listening, and make sure that there is an equal amount of both.
Great. So for mine, I did posterior pinch spots with the students. This was a very difficult technical challenge that the students had to do in one of my 3D art classes. Creating a hollow structure out of clay is very difficult to do, and the students were required to make animals out of these hollow structures. In order to keep it fun and lighthearted and engaging, the students had to also have a posterior on the animal as well. So all their animals, regardless of what animal it was, needed to have butt cheeks. And because of this, the kids just had a blast. They had a riot. They also needed to include additive elements, subtractive elements. They needed to create coils and then do what's called score and slip, which is how essentially you glue clay together. But the kids just had an absolute blast with this one. So with Bell Hooks, the classroom should be an exciting place, never boring. That was something that she often criticized Paulo Freire for not having, for not talking about how education is, like, people are going to be more inspired to learn when it's engaging and they're having more fun with it. So with that being said, the teacher is not the only sole person that is responsible for a classroom being exciting. It also has to do with the students, and when they're working together and collaborating and trying to figure out their animals and giving each other tips like, hey, your horse's anatomy needs to change a little bit, or things like that. It really brings it all together. And again, the kids were engaged. They had an absolute blast with this one.
And once again, I think that poured so nicely into like the classroom never being boring, because like I feel like if I was in your art class as a student, I would just feel like Mr. Gambino is just so crazy. He made us put butt cheeks on sculptures.
You know what? Come
This
on
is much
by in your free
fun.
period. Come on by in your free period and we'll throw some clay together. That
I
sounds
was to say I need to come down there and make something.
all right. Let's do it.
Okay. All right. So another thing that I had my students do was craft their own "Where I'm From" poem. So essentially, my hope in creating these poems is for my students, one, to start utilizing sensory language, because in Unit 3, they write their narrative. So it's really important for them to go from telling to showing. That when you're writing, you don't necessarily want to give everything away to the reader. You don't want to tell us, like, you want to give us little breadcrumbs to keep us interested till the end, right? So I really wanted this to be an exercise in using sensory language, so that they can develop those vivid descriptions and imagery, so that they can craft their own narrative poem. What I found most interesting in this process is students struggle to reflect on their lives, because they feel that as a 14-year-old, like, well, I haven't done like much of anything important. And I'm like, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be important in the sense that like other people will find it interesting. But if it's something that made an impression in your mind, or like it's been something that's been showing up in your life over and over again, then I would share that. And that's important. And oh, sorry. Can we go back for just 1 second?
Yeah, no problem.
I would also say that in this, I found it interesting because I got to learn a lot about my students, because we would conference about what they wrote. And I learned that my students they're bilingual. They may not necessarily be from this country. Their favorite food is not necessarily apple pie and hamburgers. It's something completely different that I probably never heard of, but it sounds delicious. And they come from an array of experiences, which is wonderful. And in some ways I was able to relate. In other ways, like, I was able to uplift them, to tell them that, like, that's actually really interesting. Like, if we never had this conversation, I wouldn't have known. So in that process, we were kind of able to build relationships. In this exercise, I didn't necessarily share out to the rest of the class, because we're not there yet in terms of being vulnerable. So I just pumped the brakes on that right now. But I did highlight a few students' work that did feel comfortable. And I made sure that I wanted the title to be "Power in Poetry," because there's power in your words and there's power in your art, and that's important. We can go to the next slide now, Frank. Thank you. A quote that I pulled from Bell Hooks is, "One way to build community in the classroom is to recognize the value of each individual voice," which I did through that exercise. And Bell Hooks also pulls on this idea of reading worlds and reading words. So before that we could even read words, we were reading the world, right? As children, we knew what safe and unsafe was. We knew what hot and cold was, right? We knew what light and dark is, right? We know who mom and dad is, or dad and dad, or mom and mom, or who my parent is, or who's a safe individual, right? Who's a stranger. We knew how to read the world before we knew how to read words. And sometimes for students, they may not actually able to verbalize, not actually verbalize, but they may not able to put words to it. But if you have that conversation, I noticed that, like, they'll start bringing back the memories about what their childhood was like. And that's how I was able to guide them through the process.
And that, kind of segues into my last one here with the self-portrait 3D sculpture. The students, this was all about learning on who they were, and for each other to learn who the person sitting next to them is. So they had to essentially just fill out a sheet that they had no idea what they were filling the sheet out for. It was just kind of like an introductory, who are you type thing, what matters most in your life. And then I told the students that they then had to take that sheet of paper and everything that was written on it and find out what was most important to them on that sheet and develop symbolism for each one of those things. So it's kind of like a visual poetry, and develop the symbolism for what it is that they care most about themselves, or in their lives, or what they want to be front and center about this. So And then they had to also fold these 3-dimensional boxes. So it was kind of like a technical challenge on there too. And doing this, we learn a lot about each other because I made one as well alongside my students. I get to learn where their levels are at with, using tools such as a ruler, or how, their dexterity is for folding paper. And it's really easy to learn their names when their names are front and center on their projects, and we get to chat with each other and like, hey, I noticed on that project that you included a cat. Do you have a cat? I have a cat as well. Like, let's talk about it. And it's a way to form bonds and relationships with your students. And then you hear the students asking each other things too, like, hey, you put a PlayStation logo on there. What's your gamer tag? This is mine. Let's play together after school. And it's like friendships and bonds are formed, and this is amongst like freshmen to seniors. So it's like, it's not just grade to grade. The kids are just mingling amongst each other. They're asking me questions about the one that I built for myself. So it was a really nice project that we all got to work with that. And again, back to bell hooks, to educate as a practice of freedom is a way of teaching in which anyone can learn. I like to preach in my classroom that, like, no matter who you are in school, it's like the idea that you are creative and artistic is the same thing. But I tell in my classroom, like, that's not true at all. Creative thinking is to give yourself creative confidence that you're able to approach a problem differently than the person next to you and come up with different solutions. And and that's always going to be informed about your background, like who you are, where you come from, what you've learned in the past, and all of that is going to influence your pathway forward. So the best thing to do is just keep learning more and more things. And it's like that idea of the growth mindset that if you're worried about your artistic ability, it's going to catch up, because it's a muscle that you're going to keep flexing and you're going to get better and better at it. And that is like the freedom in the art world. It's like to express yourself and practice, you're going to get better. Every artist that you can think of right now, their artwork at 4 years old looked exactly like your artwork at 4 years old. The difference is that they just kept practicing, and you might have branched off to something different. Not a bad thing, but if you want to do more artistic stuff, all you got to do is do it.
Yeah. I was also going to say, in terms of the idea of practice, bell hooks talks about how as educators, we kind of have a difficult time not necessarily getting immediate gratification in terms of what success looks like. So for success, for every student, it looks different. So for some students, it'll be within the next marking period, they'll show incredible signs of growth. But for some students, it's going to take the whole entire year. And that's completely okay. It's a process.
Yeah, I mean, that's the same reason that we have leveled classes of 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
You might not show that practice until the second or third level, because everyone is growing at a different rate and refining different sets of skills.
Absolutely. We didn't necessarily cite everything in the presentation. However, these are valuable resources
Yes.
For our colleagues. So here's the thing. If they want to, look it up themselves, they can. Also, what they can do is, if they decide to use it in their own professional work, it's already cited for them to use. So best of both worlds, it's done.
So as far as the prompt goes, why should teachers use the knowledge of students when planning for instruction? I just wrote, because they deserve it. Every student has a unique story to tell. Knowing about your students will only help to build better relationships, but will also enrich their education by opening up new ways to make content more meaningful to their lives. And understanding how social classifications impact their lives will help build a healthy and equitable community.
And I said that without further training or education, teachers lean on old, ineffective practices in a desperate effort to meet standards and testing scores. And as teachers are under a lot of pressure. And unfortunately, teachers are in a constant battle between working with and against the system. And teachers should use the knowledge of students when planning for instruction, because we need to treat students as subjects, not objects. So we're in a constant battle. Given the system, we're in a battle of treating students like containers of knowledge. Like, we just pour, and I hope you catch all of it. And if you don't, I don't know what to tell you. Yep. Rather, we should treat students as subjects, where we are learning about what do our students already know, so that we can build on that knowledge and grow from there, and help build deeper connections so that whatever we teach, it really soaks into their mind and that they're able to actually retain that knowledge and then apply it.
Yeah, less of that assembly line approach of you should know
Right.
this here and this here.
Right.
Fantastic. All right, cool. So we want to leave you with this quote from Bell Hooks. To be changed by ideas was a pure pleasure. Home was the place where I was forced to conform to someone else's image of who I was and what I should be. School is the place where I could forget that self and through ideas, invent myself.
Thank you. Listen, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for riding with us. You're a real one. Appreciate you. Frank and I appreciate you. And we hope that you have a fantastic day, and I hope that you got something out of this. Okay.
Make sure you put on your exit ticket the 3 points that you learned on our 4th slide.
Oh my gosh. Frank.
Yes.
We did it.
Did it. High five. Boom. That's going in the video. All right. Let me stop recording. There we go. More. Stop recording.